Welcome to the final round of Campbelltown Australs. The two teams before me are debating the motion that Western-operated technology and social media companies, e.g. Facebook, Apple, and Twitter, should not give in to requests by non-democratic actors to block certain apps or users. Some speakers in the debate have chosen not to be recorded this round, so that will explain the gaps in the debate. I'd like to welcome the first negating speaker.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Two things in this speech. Number one, this jeopardizes the opportunity to have this technology as a platform at all. And number two is if both stay, then their side potentially jeopardizes the lives of people on the ground. The status quo that we're going to defend on opposition is we're obviously going to give to some requests. We'll assess them on a case-by-case basis. On the whole, we'll probably accept more. Apple, for example, has agreed to block certain apps, like ones with violence, etc., in exchange for the App Store as a whole remaining in China, for example. So there are a variety of middle grounds where we could take. We don't think we have to go out of our way to deliberately suppress them, only in situations where the state actually asks us to do this. The main response we have is towards their broad case that generally banning dissent exacerbates echo chambers and so on. So I'll observe that this is all hinged on the outcome that they keep the app within this area, or they keep the app within this country. And so presumably having no echo, having no space for discussion at all, being exposed entirely to the news, which is a one-way source of media, being only be able to talk to your family members, etc., or seeing what the president speaks up at speeches is presumably a worse echo chamber. So we're just going to put the most amount of pressure on the weakest part of the argument in their case, where they say states will bluff, but they will fail at doing this and they'll just let the app stay. So I have three first direct responses to their broad proof, so just to take it down on its own, and then I have three separate reasons that are stronger than the individual reasons they give for why states would kick you off the platform. So the first thing they say is that many of these states don't have the resources to build their apps. Maybe they don't have to. Maybe they can contract with other authoritarian states that agree with them in principle and are happy to provide them with the technology. So Kazakhstan, what they did actually was negotiate with contracts with China to send over the technology and schematics for things like setting up Bilibili and Weibo, which are alternatives to Western technology, but with much more stringent censorships and so on. Secondly, many of these authoritarian states do have the resources to build their own apps, or at the very least restrict targetively. So their main proof is that rich people don't like their internet getting shut down. That's not what happened in Kazakhstan, because they run the internet grid, so they just shut down certain internet service providers in certain neighborhoods, but definitely not in their equivalent of Beverly Hills. Like Israel itself, the main example they gave in the beginning of their speech, has the resources to set up their own social media network. So in reality, even if some states are authoritarian, we just make the observation that their point of them not being able to bluff doesn't make sense. Their final point is that it will be incredibly unpopular with lots of the rich people, to which we say it's not clear why this is something authoritarian states care about, since they're, one, not particularly democratic and they don't really need the incentive for these people. But number two is that if it is unpopular with a lot of expats and so on, that's probably good for them, because it means there's less competition for things like industry and so on. It means that domestic competitors can flourish. Beyond that, though, by moving into the first argument, in the first scenario, where we argue that they have a much higher chance of getting banned and are going to get banned much quicker, there are also three additional reasons for why they will get kicked off wholesale. The first is that if you are explicitly and publicly rejecting all, that is refusing to comply with corporations and the government, when the corporation is refusing to comply with regulations you consented to while operating in the first place, not only do governments have an explicit public mandate to ban you, they also fear, in a game theory sense, other corporations attempting to do this. So maybe Gov might argue that the initial cost is not so high for corporations, but if it's something that other corporations realize they can do and still continue to make money in these areas, this becomes a massive loss that outweighs the potential bane that corporations that states witness on government, and hence would continue to ban just as a preemptive measure. Number two is that Western companies will just leave because they face a lot of legal costs, because they're continuously getting hounded by the state, because they're continuously getting requested time and time again. They may literally get imprisoned, like what American tech executives were experiencing in China, because of the fact that they were resisting many Chinese demands. But the third thing is that the act of itself refusing to comply with state action will itself create a massive exodus of many people leaving the platform because they're afraid of being massively associated with the platform. So even if Gov stays, the effect is that it eventually becomes a ghost town because people aren't willing to risk their lives to stay on the platform. Why do we on our side retain? So the first is that trivially authoritarian regimes don't have the same amount of popular support, two, incentive or impetus, because they don't see you as large of a threat. Number two is that if they were to do it, then they don't have the immediate cause or the immediate knowledge that you're doing things against them, and would instead have to do an in-depth investigation, which would be much more costly and take a lot more time. And number three is that beyond that, even if we do get banned, it would take a much longer time to do it, which means that we still get to influence the change for 5-6 more years. So having said that, why is keeping these apps in a limited form substantially better than removing them wholesale. So the first observation is that there's a very large space of public information that is beneficial to international free speech, to breaking echo chambers and democracy, all of the arguments that Gov wants that non-democratic states don't know to ask about or don't know to regulate about. There are three types. The first is neutrally coded information about what things are like on the ground, which gives people in other countries data about the economic situation in these areas, about what it's like when they go to school, etc., about like what the quality of education is like, for example. Number two is that there are also non-public messages that states don't know to ask for in the first place, like requests for help or communication with family abroad. And number three is the implicit absorption of Western culture, of freedom and democracy, even in mundane ways like the American Idol, which is they watch videos of in Somalia to normalize the idea of democracy and public participation, or expressions of individual expressions like dancing or singing that break previous taboos of filial piety, and essentially normalizing Western values and encouraging to speak up more. This has three clear benefits. The first is that, again, as Gov says, this is the prerequisite for international aid, which means in the majority of cases where they get banned, like in 90% of times, where they get total internet blackouts, or they get targeted blackouts permanently in neighborhoods where these activists live, they never get access to any of these things and no one ever knows about this. And on comparison, on our side, there are many innocuous or invisible ways that people can get out, so long as they're able to have the platform available in the first place to speak up. Number two is that even if it's targeting specifically activist information, they can also mobilize collective action in the form of general non-activist oriented dissent for them to be able to raise concerns to the government and actually have complaints be heard. But number three is that on comparative, this is much better than the pre-existing echo chamber. Maybe there's some discussion and maybe that discussion is government leaning, but at the very least, it is better than only being able to receive direct propaganda, which is a much, much worse echo chamber in comparison for the reasons we give earlier, that they have literally no control, they cannot participate, they cannot share their thoughts on it, so on and so forth. The second observation is that when you shut down these apps, right, the tech itself is just good. So even if government is right that there's no activist expression anymore, losing out on many other valuable forms of information, like, for example, being able to watch YouTube to get massive amounts of education, to upskill yourself and improve your tech knowledge and be able to upskill, just generally get out of poverty, or for example, essential services like on Amazon Web Services, which are vital for many companies in the economy to have working websites in the first place, or the financial bank rails that Apple and PayPal offer to many of these places, like they just go away essentially when you get wholesale ban from the government, when you get wholesale ban from the country, because authoritarian states don't care about the economic experience of people on the ground so long as they themselves perceive themselves as safe, which means this tech is just good. And the comparative is either they lose this tech entirely, which makes the lives of the average person on the ground much worse, which is much more important than their prospective benefits of potentially improving the free speech, because it's a guaranteed harm that they lose this, or they maintain these services, but it is entirely replaced wholesale by Chinese or by Russian alternatives that are contracted, which gives much, much more money for these terrible states, as Gov says, to continue to oppress people, because you fund their militaries, you fund their oppression. That's the first outcome. And it shows that when they get banned and when we stay, it's much better. If we both get banned, we get banned after 10, 15 years, which means that we'll have much longer to have the chance of potential freedom and potential future free speech and democratic change. So we have much more information to act in the first place, as opposed to never having that information at all. The second argument is that if we both stay, and presumably the argument Gov wants is that will censor some people, the problem on government is that governments will literally use this as a hit list to go into people's homes and commit political violence. The first observation is, if you're talking about Israel as an apartheid state that is so terrible to people and is willing to shut down individual accounts, I imagine that the alternative for them to be able to cut out their free speech is to just have violent retaliation, move into their homes and to kill them, and generally states as a whole becoming more belligerent since they feel like they need to crack down on these things since they cannot control the flow of information, whereas on our side, at least they feel relatively safer because they have some say in the way that information is exposed, which means on comparison, states become generally more violent and the oppression itself actually gets worse. Maybe government is right that they get some more mitigation, which is plausibly good, but this comes at the cost of making the oppression substantially worse, which means that they need even more mitigation to reach the same level of benefit. But it's just far too late. They've killed far too many people. At the end of the speech, it is clear it's why they should comply. Negate.
I'd like to welcome the second negating speaker.
Hello, can I be heard? All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The government team has really bought the Apple Kool-Aid. They come here and they say that these authoritarian regimes, they need Western companies. They couldn't potentially exist without their MacBooks and other integrated systems that clearly we only produce ever in the West, and thus their alternative is technological desperation. Clearly, if this debate existed maybe 20 years ago, this would be the case. But I think what David quite succinctly provides is that there is a clear, strong alternative, whether it be the hardware systems that they talk about, Huawei, Oppo phones, which actually make up the majority of new ownership, especially in the developing and authoritarian regimes they talk about, but also in the alternative software systems, whether we talk about WeChat, whether we talk about VK.com, whether we talk about Weibo. This is ultimately to suggest that there isn't just like some small peddling potential alternative infrastructure for authoritarian regimes, but there is an entire alternative cyberspace that has its own propaganda, that has its own biases, but is significantly worse because one, they have the capacity to use strong predictive algorithms to punish people immediately at a much larger scale than you would get at OP, at which they request individual bans. But secondly, all of the money that gets traded in between these authoritarian regimes either goes to China and the owners who typically have strong connections with these authoritarian regimes, or to the authoritarian governments themselves. This is ultimately to suggest what they're peddling on Gov, which is to suggest that they're going to be forced into it, is a fake alternative, and that ultimately they should be forced to defend what is already the pre-existing reality, which is not just censorship, but state media control. I am going to talk about this kind of debate within five things actually. First of all, I'll talk about this comparative technological advantage in depth. Second of all, I'll talk about naivety and the alternative control mechanisms that they could use. Third of all, I'll talk about the spectrum debate, providing things to the general population versus a specific individual who is technically expertise and could access things like VPNs. Fourthly, I'll talk about the range of those VPNs. And fifthly, I'll talk about the risk of political agitation. First of all, let's talk about this technical comparative advantage. So I think, as alluded to in the intro, there are largely a lot of reasons to why these things could be emergent within these authoritarian regimes. I think we give a lot of examples, they give a lot of examples. I think their examples just necessarily a little bit weaker. Their primary example is Israel, which is already a very strong tech startup. They say that there are some reasons to why it might just be a Kazakhstan, which is a fluke because it's proximate. I think that this kind of just breaks down to the real world, primarily because there are already strong Chinese investments in Africa and Central Asia to where a lot of authoritarian regimes exist. Even if that wasn't the case, I would imagine that typically, if we're talking about software, these things could be spread instantaneously online. If it's hardware, these are things that generally there's a long interest to invest. So I think just on the top layer, this access is perfectly accessible for a lot of these authoritarian states. But secondly, I would also suggest that there's a strong, even absent this, capability internally. So I think there are two segmented things that they could do. The first one is just the internal regulation of their ISP. So I mean, they kind of just suggest that they don't actually know what they're doing because they can't actually have the information to target things like dissidents. I mean, like, surely the response for these states is what they suggest, general media blackouts. I mean, their only reason to suggest that they wouldn't do this is because the rich and powerful don't want this to happen. Like, surely then you could just have media information, but only for rich people. I don't understand, if they already have things like apartheid within these states, why they could have just have like different degrees of service for people. And thirdly, I would just like to suggest that even if there were potential technical limitations, surely the process at which they would develop it would be terrible, which is to suggest that even if they have temporary like access to information right now, presumably you make a lot of things like BK and Weibo much stronger in the future as more states start funding them in order to get those degrees of infrastructures to spread, which is to suggest either they have no technical capability on Gov to actually make sure that these people don't get banned, but the second thing is, in the long run, clearly it would be so that these institutions and states would be stronger and stronger. Second of all, let's talk about the naivety of oppression. My thoughts on this are, I think government kind of has a lack of imagination here, because their kind of case is to simply suggest that, well, it would be very difficult, and in terms of prestige, it would seem as though the country is significantly more oppressive and therefore they wouldn't do it. I mean, I think this clearly doesn't fit the tipping point. If you're already committed to an apartheid regime, if you're already committed to oppression of dissidents, presumably banning things like Twitter wouldn't be the point at which you'd be like, this is actually too far in terms of our strength of international legitimacy. But the second thing is, they don't respond to our argument on op, right? Which is to suggest that if these spaces go unfettered, then presumably if they can't control the media on top, they'll just talk about the individual posters on the ground, right? Whether it be tracing their IP addresses through Facebook at a point they can't control, because local providers would likely give that information to the state anyway, because they are the state, or even things just like general suppression. They say that there's a chilling effect on Gov primarily when you ban this, but presumably if on Gov they start punishing all of the people who choose to post on Facebook, then there's even greater chilling effect, primarily because the visceral like interaction with their sacrifice and their suffering becomes much more clear. I'm also going to integrate the point about VPNs here. So I think the response to states is like, one, they could ban commercial VPNs, ExpressVPN, etc. pretty easily. Secondly, there's potentially a case on Gov in which you could set up your own domestic VPN. That's a little harder because it requires things like port forwarding, which are often beyond the reach of an average individual, especially an oppressed minority, like they suggest on Gov. But thirdly, even if this is the case, I think it kind of breaks what they're trying to say. Because if they want to have this generalized, accessible information that allows things like citizen journalism, if this isn't accessible to most people, then likely it means that you wouldn't get this because the vast majority of information would go unfilmed, unposted because most people wouldn't have the chance. So I think just to remind the comparative here on OP, there are a bunch of things that they don't have on Gov at all, which is to suggest that one, all of the private chats and information that you could spread to your family, local community that likely wouldn't be reported to the police because these are things that the state doesn't reach out to, they don't get on Gov because the state has blanket bans. And in a world where they're using things like WeChat, these are things that are going to be directly visible to the state, in which there's an internal degree of censorship. But secondly, even if you don't believe that, I would also suggest that in the world where they're operating on Gov, where they have these internal degrees of censorship, even if they can't actually censor you, it is the fear that these things are state-owned and you don't have the company behind you that makes it significantly worse, in which you don't post at all, even if the state doesn't have the technical capacity to regulate. This also leads me to my third thing about like how you would weigh these two things up. So like I could potentially see it to be the case that on Gov, there are still some people who could potentially access this information and they could potentially get things like some degree of some media reaching out. But I would still suggest, in terms of the gravity of the utility, this is so much worse for them. Like, think about the way that we argued it on OP, that then we have things like a global form of shared information, Facebook, Twitter, etc. These are things that, one, provide major tangible benefits individually. Like, they don't provide a principal distinction. Like, being poor in and of itself is a form of oppression, even if it is not the state who caused it. Presumably, if we on OP can get more people out of poverty, this is a form of reverse or upliftment that we create. But secondly, even if there is some like special thing about how the intent to oppress is significantly worse, at the very least, we have like a larger degree of freedoms that you can access to on OP, which they wouldn't get on Gov because the network becomes intertwined with other authoritarian states, which means you cannot directly ask them for help. But finally, I'd like to talk about this whole point about agitation for political change. So even if we believe everything that we get from Gov, I don't think that that's a winning case because they don't necessarily prove the tipping point that this is actually going to get a change or a form of regime change or a form of gradual reform, primarily because they say that political agitation increases, but they don't suggest that this political agitation would be enough to do things like change the instances within China or Israel. We suggest two things. One, that the converse of cultural change is likely significantly more effective because it deals with your interactions with your local community, which are the most proximate to you. But two, presumably, if you have more political agitation, the state becomes more fearful, the state becomes more oppressive because they recognize that there's going to be a large opposition against them. Political opposition only leads to failed revolutions if they don't prove that they ever get the change that they want. With that, I'm proud to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome the third negating speaker.
Hello. Oh, sorry. My output?
He's gonna jump down from the chair.
No, he won't.
He's thinking about it already.
Stop. He wants to be next to me. Okay.
It's kind of cool.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So affirmative has a lot to say about the dissidents in authoritarian countries, but very little about how this policy would actually be able to help them at the end of the day. Because as Quintin points out, I think that they set a very high threshold for them to prove that perhaps this leads to some regime change, or maybe this gets better for the protesters. But we prove to you time and again that in actuality, this does nothing. This only radicalizes the regime and puts more people at harm for actions that are even worse, and more people even who may not be engaged in political activism, who simply happen to see these posts online and are cracked down because of the fact that you do not give concessions to states on the side of affirmative, right? There are two things that I want to point out at the very top of my speech before I go into some analysis about the scenarios that happen in the round and why, like, what ends up happening in the instances where these apps are blocked and what ends up happening and when they are not blocked. So first, I think that the first thing that we had to expect Affirmative to do was talk about why the removal of a few users or these users means that these apps become absolutely useless. To be clear, it is Affirmative who ought to implement the whole blanket policy of denying non-democratic states in its entirety without any discussion or any room for concession. And I think our side is just in general a lot more reasonable, where we adhere to status quo, taking this on by a case-by-case basis. But even then, I don't think that they make any attempt to weigh why all requests are going to be unreasonable, or why it isn't even worth discussing before we choose to reject these requests to begin with. The second thing I want to point out is, again, we limit perhaps the kinds of information. They have a problem with the fact that they limit the people who are on these apps. But here's the thing, right? They have yet to respond to the first idea that governments generally increase their violence because if they say that governments wouldn't actually decide to block these corporations, they're still valuable, they wouldn't be able to have the infrastructure, then that is the case where governments become extremely paranoid that these things are still within their country and would choose to use worse means like boots on the ground to crack down on people, more imprecise means, etc., that make this just far worse and far more grotesque. The second thing is, I also think side Affirmative relies on the governments using this power quite often, using the power to ban people quite often. But I think that we proved to you that it's actually quite difficult for states to use this requesting power to begin with in status quo. For example, yes, Israel bans 500 accounts at most, but there are still tens of thousands activists still posting on Facebook because they don't have the machinery, the capital, etc. to ban absolutely everyone, which means that they say we would never know about it, but we absolutely do know about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. Otherwise, we would not be able to talk about it today, right? The other reasons that they give, I think, are also just supplementary into solidifying the fact that governments do not just use this randomly and without scrutiny, right? Especially like they talk about how governments wouldn't want people to be angry at them, and so they likely would not want to do this very often and use these extreme circumstances, right? That is the reason why it is Affirmative side who refuse to engage with these corrections and Affirmative who is ultimately unreasonable at the end of the day, right? I also want to emphasize they only work under the assumption that these governments are doing action, and the only action these governments have to perform are purely legislative and only come to banning. But when governments understand that they cannot ban you from these sites, governments understand that they have no power and Western corporations are actively trying to delegitimize their power, that is when they do other actions on the other 50% of the time, where they go to your house, they imprison you, they punish you, etc., because they have no alternatives. They tried to respond to this at some point, I guess, by talking about how people can consent to having their lives on the line. But the first thing is, it's not like people always have the knowledge that the government would do this, right? And the government would always crack down on you. Like, it's not a reasonable thing if you can't consent if you don't know about it. But the second thing is, this also doesn't apply to when the government decides to kill your family, your co-workers, and people affiliated with you because of what is going on because of this to begin with, right? Which is why we are okay with like the banning. These concessions are things that are okay, and we ought not to just completely ban everything because it makes these apps far worse off at the end of the day. The first thing I want to talk about then is what happens in the instances where these apps are blocked, right? The first thing I want to deconstruct are the reasons they give that states won't block this app. There are a few. The first is they try to talk about how they don't have the infrastructure or the technology. Obviously, we said you can likely just relegate it to another state or another corporation who does have the technology and who is willing to do so. They have a few responses to this that tries to talk about how, oh no, you're so far from each other. The only reason why Kazakhstan and China were able to do this was because they were so near each other, right? But here's the thing, you are also far from Facebook terminals, and yet you're still able to have them. You're still able to like use their technology. Like, have you heard of the cloud? Have you heard of a hard drive that you are able to like use to share technology and share information? This is just a little bit ridiculous and shows that they don't want to imagine this debate and full-heartedly engage in it, right? They even talk about how you have no money, Autocash should be more oppressive when you have this technology, but these are just kind of throwaway responses at WHIP. Even if we had to take these seriously, I think that these states would still find this to be an imperative that they would choose to invest in if they understand that this is important to being able to further stabilize their power, right? Which probably means that you will have these apps blocked. They also write down about how you don't want to upset the ruling class. Again, like what ends up usually happening is that you only remove the access to the internet from people from the lower echelons, and oftentimes it is within the ruling class that you're able to coerce the internet to, or ensure that they have access to those types of things. Even when they try to have the analysis that people can use VPNs anyway, I think that it's just very like difficult to believe this, right? You can only only use the VPN if like you have the infrastructure to begin with, and to manufacture the VPN from scratch is very difficult for an average individual to do. Secondly, you still need the internet to do this, right? Obviously, if the state removes the internet in entirety, you likely won't have this. Sometimes it's even expensive when you have to pay for VPN. The last thing we talk about is how states just won't ban this, right? Because there are no alternatives to these apps because people love their MacBooks so much. But obviously, this is just empirically false. I think that maybe Western corporations wouldn't want to partner with these states. But again, there are states from other authoritarian regimes like China who has Bilibili, WeChat, etc., who would be willing to lend you these technologies if and they would be just willing to work with you, which likely means that there's a feasible alternatives that these non-democratic states would rather opt into, right? I think that we just give you the reasons for why there are high incentives even for these states to go through with this, because they don't want to be the culture of complacency wherein corporations stop taking states seriously because they feel like they are bluffing, and that's why there are high incentives to block, which they simply choose to ignore and say that this is not going to happen to begin with. And even then, we engage in the instances when states don't block this. And so perhaps states are just bluffing, and why this is still absolutely terrible, right? The fact is, the message that you are sending as Western corporations is that you do not take this state seriously. You don't take the request from them seriously, and you make them feel illegitimate. And insofar as the goal of non-democratic states oftentimes is to secede and control the people and ensure that they have power for the longest time, that is when you have the arbitrary crackdowns due to paranoia, even amongst average people who just so happen to see a political post on their timeline, who just so happen to see political dissidents, even if they are not actively involved in the movement. And that's when you have the worst amounts of violence that the other opposing side keeps on wanting to reject to begin with, right? I think this leads into the argument of political dissidents and where we best preserve these types of things, right? Because it's our side at the very least, we have these concessions to these corporations and to these countries, and at the very least, we are able to solidify the stability and presence of these apps in these countries, right? Because the point is, the longer that these apps and these corporations are in the country, the more people internalize their presence, which is why in the future, it becomes even harder to remove the presence of these apps to begin with when people internalize these as part of their everyday lives and rely on these even more. But you need to ensure the presence of these apps to begin with, which we prove to you exclusively coming from side negative. For all of these reasons, oppose. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the negating reply.
Hello, can I be heard? All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. So this is actually a pretty interesting debate. If I were to judge, the way I approach it is first eliminate scenario. So Gov doesn't seriously entertain a world where we get banned and they don't get banned. And they also don't entertain a world where we both get banned, because if they were to do that, that would implicitly concede most of their benefits are gone. So this is mostly about the situation where they get banned, we don't, and the world where none of us get banned. But just to be clear, in those two plausible scenarios, like we're clearly winning, especially since the material we have is pre-existing. Let's move into the first part, which we think where we're clearly crushing them, which is the stuff where they get banned and we don't get banned. And their proof to show that this scenario is unlikely is to say, apps are very useful, losing them is quite inconvenient, and these states are technologically impaired. We have a series of responses to this that they don't really recover from. So the first thing we show is that it's just not an inconvenience. Like there are existing substitutes. Quintin makes this joke about how they've drank the Apple Kool-Aid. It's just unfortunately true that like you just replace your MacBook with another laptop. So one, it's not that large an inconvenience for the upper class. Two, we show that it's targetive. So they'll take away MacBooks for like the poor people, but they won't take it away from those that are already rich in these communities. Number three, we show that even if it is an inconvenience, letting tech companies act with an impunity is an existential threat to its case, if it is the case that Gov is claiming much as large benefits as they are. And so the game theory fear of letting them continue to do this and push the boundaries of what the state allows even further would be much more of an inconvenience to the state, and so they ban it wholesale. And then the fourth and final thing is Quintin shows that all of their prerequisites to allow people to access the technology, like having a VPN and so on, limits the benefit they have massively of free speech. And this shows that this is the main scenario in the debate. And in the scenario where they get wholly banned on Gov and we don't get banned on Op, we're crushing them. Why do we crush them on this? The first thing is we show the echo chamber just generally improves relative to the echo chamber they would have, because they may say the echo chamber legitimizes certain ideas, but you can still have discussion about your personal experiences under this. Maybe it's not so positive. Maybe it doesn't have to be the degree of shitting on the state, but it's certainly a lot more democratic, a lot more useful, especially about sharing useful information, or like even just being able to talk to your family members relative to the existence of a world without this, and you only really have the alternative of the news. Unless you believe that our initial point that there are existing alternatives like Weibo and Bilibili, in which case the harm arising is that it is now wholly controlled by the Chinese government, which means the relative propaganda is much worse, and in addition, money is going to the CCP to oppress people even more. So there's a bit of a fork in the scenarios, and in either side of the scenario, we're crushing them there. The second is there are a series of important non-targeted benefits, because one of the important nuances of the analysis is that there is a set of things states don't know to target, and they would not activate the mechanism to get people to ban it. And the example that they give on Gov about Israel targeting Palestinian dissenters is the best example for us, because it shows even in their most extremely cherry-picked example, they still like have information about Palestinian dissenters. We still know about these things. It still reaches and we're still able to give them international aid. So it's not actually clear that they reach many of their harms. But what we show is that a series of unambiguous goods, like maybe it's not active information, but just tweeting about your day, just knowing what life is like in China, actively informs us about whether or not people are suffering on the ground, whether or not it's an important area to target in the first place. Beyond that, the variety of other unambiguous goods like being able to upskill, being able to pull yourself out of poverty, being able to use financial ways of the system. And so in this situation where they remove most of these benefits, the two forks that result in the 95% chance where we have this scenario, we're winning this debate by quite a large margin, especially since our attempt to engage really just stops at this might legitimize certain ideas implicitly, whereas their side forces people to be wholly immersed only and without competition in a state-owned alternative like VK.com in Russia, like Bilibili and so on. But the second alternative is, what if both sides are just allowed? To which we said, one, this doesn't meet the threshold to push for change in the same way. So this just means that if they actually get people to activate on the streets, but it's much more rushed, it's much more short term, people still get shot and they die. And beyond that, we say that the act of blanket refusal by companies is different from just getting people on the ground to speak. But the action of refusing every attempt by the government to do this is a sudden discomforting shift where governments react by increasing the amount of oppression, by relatively decreasing everyone's access, and in addition, targeting dissenters even more using violence explicitly. And we said that the chance of their benefit wasn't worth the chance of increased violence, even if the chance of increased violence was marginally less than the chance of their benefit. So in the 5% of debates where this scenario is the one that wins out, it's not worth that benefit. And in addition, even if they did have a benefit, it doesn't weigh the massive risk that you're putting on the people's lives. And that's why, for this reason, we negate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both teams. That was an excellent debate, and good luck for the break.